Renee Bryant was 41 years old when she watched her husband of 16 years hold up a lottery ticket on the evening news and say the words $300 million into a microphone. And she knew, before the anchor finished the sentence, before the camera cut away from his face, that something in the way he was standing told her she was not part of what came next. She worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic in Nashville. She drove a 10-year-old Hyundai, the color of old pewter. She brought her lunch in a brown paper bag and wore her hair pinned back because it was practical. Jerome's coworkers called her Quiet Renee, and Jerome never corrected them, not once in 16 years, which told you something if you were paying attention. He came home 3 nights after the press conference and set 2 envelopes on the kitchen counter while she was washing the dinner dishes. One was her name on a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment across town. The other was divorce papers, already filed. He had moved $47,000 out of their joint account before the ticket was ever announced publicly. What Jerome did not know, what he had never thought to ask in 16 years, was what Renee's father had made her sign the week before their wedding, or where that document had been kept ever since. What happened in that lawyer's office 6 weeks later would cost Jerome Bryant every dollar he believed was already his. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening light settled into the kitchen the way it did every October in Nashville, amber in particular. Slanting through the window above the sink and catching the edge of the wooden knife block Renee had built herself the summer after her father passed. She had built it from a piece of walnut salvaged from a tree her father had cut down in the backyard of the house she grew up in, milled it at a workshop on the other side of town, sanded it down over 3 weekends until the grain ran smooth under her fingers. Jerome had looked at it once, the week she brought it home, and said it was a nice block. He had not asked where the wood came from. She ran her thumb across the top of it now while she waited for the coffee to finish, the way she did most mornings without thinking, a small private ritual that meant something she had never tried to explain. Her father, Calvin Bryant, had been a contract attorney for 33 years in Memphis. He was not a famous man. He worked out of a small office above a dry cleaner and represented people who could not afford anyone better, and he did it with a kind of precision that made him, in certain circles, a man other attorneys quietly respected. He had 2 sayings he repeated so often Renee could hear them now in his exact voice. The paper is the truth. Everything else is conversation. And the person who controls the document controls the outcome. He had been gone 4 years. She still thought about him every time she read anything important before she signed it. She had met Jerome 11 years into her father's practice at a barbecue hosted by a mutual friend on a late June afternoon in Memphis. Jerome was tall and easy-talking, the kind of man who made a room feel more comfortable just by arriving in it. He had a way of finding the one person standing alone near the drinks table and making them feel like they had been the destination all along. He worked in sales and was good at it, which meant he understood how to make people feel chosen, and Renee had loved that quality before she understood that the same instinct that made him good at selling also made him good at concealing. They married after 2 years that she would later describe, very carefully, as a reasonable amount of happiness. She had gone into the marriage with open eyes in her father's counsel and one document she had never mentioned to Jerome and never intended to, because her father had told her some things you kept in the drawer and let speak only when they needed to. Jerome had never asked what was in the safe deposit box. That told her something too. The first signal had arrived not 3 nights ago with the envelopes, but 7 months earlier, in the form of a lottery ticket Jerome had purchased on a Tuesday and never mentioned. She had found the receipt in his jacket pocket while moving laundry, seen the date, and thought nothing of it. People bought lottery tickets. She photographed the receipt anyway, the way her father had taught her to photograph anything that might later become relevant, and filed it away in the back of her memory without comment. One data point. Incomplete, without context. Then the context arrived, in pieces, across several months. A phone conversation she caught the edge of through the bathroom door one Saturday morning, Jerome's voice lower than his usual register. The particular flattened tone of someone selecting each word before it left their mouth. A restaurant charge on the joint bank statement she reviewed every month, without announcing that she did so. For an evening he had described as a late work obligation. A name in his phone she recognized as belonging to a woman he had claimed not to have seen in 2 years. And then, 7 weeks before the press conference, a change in his manner so subtle that most people would have missed it. A slight acceleration in his movements. A new attentiveness to his phone that he masked with practiced casualness. The mood of a man who was quietly waiting for something. She had not confronted him. There was no advantage in confrontation. She kept watching, and she kept filing, and she kept the receipt in the folder her father had labeled household in his careful hand. Then the evening news ran the segment, and the watching was over, and what began instead was something quieter and more deliberate than anger. She found the secondary account on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days after the press conference and 6 days after the envelopes. She pulled the full credit report she had been entitled to request, and had requested, every 2 years without exception, since her father had advised her to begin the practice in her late 20s. Calvin Bryant had been methodical about the things he believed in, and he believed that a woman who knew the full picture of her own financial standing was a woman who could not be entirely surprised. Jerome had opened the account 14 months ago. The deposits into it were regular and deliberate, drawn from a source she could not immediately identify, but that did not match any income he had ever reported to her. She sat with the statement for a long time, the coffee going cold at her elbow, and she did the arithmetic the way her father had taught her to do arithmetic, not with feeling, with accuracy. Her hands did not shake. She was a woman who had spent 7 years working the front desk of a physical therapy clinic, which meant she had spent 7 years watching people rebuild what their bodies had interrupted, watching them discover, with patience and with repetition, and with no small amount of quiet stubbornness, the paths that existed around damage they had not chosen. She understood something about recovery that people who had never sat beside it often missed. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. It was one carefully placed step, and then another, until the ground between you and the damage was wide enough that the damage no longer determined the direction. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She spent the rest of the afternoon building her record. She cross-referenced 3 years of joint bank statements against the folder in her filing cabinet. The one her father had labeled household in the careful block letters he used for things he meant to last. The one she had maintained without fail for 16 years, because he had asked her to, and she had understood. Even when she was 25 and newly married and had no specific reason to anticipate needing it, that her father did not ask for things without a reason. The pattern was clear once she laid it flat. 14 months. $47,000 moved in increments precisely calibrated to stay beneath the thresholds that would have generated any kind of automatic notice. 4 restaurant charges on the secondary account, on evenings she could match to his stated whereabouts. A hotel in Cincinnati, 2 nights longer than the conference he had cited, for a conference she had just confirmed, ran only 3 days. She photographed each page with her phone. She created a folder on her personal laptop. She named it with nothing but the date, because the date was sufficient. Then she picked up her phone and made a single call. "Daddy's friend," she said when Philip Adesanya answered. "I need an hour of your time. Sooner is better." He said he could see her the following morning. She thanked him, set the phone down, and went to make dinner, because Jerome would be home in 2 hours, and she was not ready to have the conversation that ending dinner would imply. Philip Adesanya had practiced family law in Nashville for 26 years and had been her father's closest professional friend for the last 15 of Calvin's life. He was 64, deliberate in speech, and wore the same kind of rimless glasses her father had worn, which she had always found quietly comforting. He had attended her father's funeral. He had sent her a card every year on Calvin's birthday since. When she walked into his office and placed the documentation folder on his desk without a word, he looked at it for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at her. "Tell me about the ticket," he said. She told him everything she knew about the timeline, the Tuesday receipt she had found in March, the press conference she had watched 6 days ago, the envelopes on the counter 3 nights after. Philip set his pen down. He filed before the winnings were officially transferred into any account, he said. He was trying to establish a separation date that predated the asset. "I know," Renee said. "He almost got away with that. I know that too," she said. "But he bought the ticket on a Tuesday in March. We were married on that Tuesday in March. We were still legally married. The ticket was purchased during the marriage." Philip looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was revising his assessment of a situation he had believed he already understood. "There is something else," she said. She reached into her bag and placed a single folded document on the desk beside the folder. She did not unfold it yet. "My father had me sign this the week before my wedding. I have kept it in a safe deposit box for 16 years. Philip unfolded it. He read it. He set it flat on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "Calvin Bryant," he said softly, mostly to himself. He called it a clarity document, Renee said. He said it was not a prenuptial agreement in the traditional sense. He said it was a record of independent financial standing at the time of marriage, notarized, witnessed, and filed with his office as a legal instrument. He said if I ever needed it, I would know when, and I would know who to give it to. Real power operated in quiet rooms. Philip spent the following 2 weeks building the counter case with the methodical attention of a man who understood he was working with material that did not appear often and needed to be handled without error. He pulled the full marriage certificate, the joint account records going back 16 years, the documentation of Renee's contributions to the account, and the specific transaction record for the $4 purchase, the one that had come from an ATM withdrawal from the joint checking account on the same Tuesday morning the receipt showed. He requested the winnings timeline from the Lottery Commission. He reviewed the separation filing date against the press conference date, against the announcement date, and found what Renee had already known he would find. Jerome had moved quickly, but not quickly enough. The clarity document her father had prepared was, in legal terms, a premarital financial affidavit, with a specific clause Calvin had written himself and had another attorney review and notarize. A clause addressing the disposition of any asset acquired during the marriage using marital funds, marital time, or the labor of either party. It established Renee's right to equitable consideration in any such asset, regardless of whose name appeared on the acquisition document. Calvin had written it because he had seen, in 33 years of family law, exactly how the absence of such a document could be used. He had spent an afternoon writing it above a dry cleaner in Memphis because he loved his daughter, and because he was a man who planned for the days he hoped would never come. The lottery ticket had been purchased with $4 drawn from a joint account to which Renee had contributed every month for 16 years. It had been purchased on a Tuesday during a marriage that was, on that Tuesday, fully intact under Tennessee law. The $300 million winnings, $182 million after federal withholding, to be transferred in a single payment, had been announced while the marriage remained legally in effect. Jerome's separation filing had come 4 days after the announcement. His transfer of $47,000 from the joint account had come 3 days before it. Jerome's attorney, a man named Garrett from a high net worth practice, whose corner office looked down over the Cumberland River, had built his entire argument on 2 premises: that the ticket was a personal purchase with no marital character, and that the separation filing established a legal date that predated the winnings transfer. He was skilled and prepared, and had won cases on thinner arguments than this one. He had not known about Calvin Bryant's document. He had not known that a contract attorney in Memphis had spent an afternoon, 16 years ago, writing a clause that addressed almost exactly this situation, because Calvin Bryant had read enough family court records over a career to know that extraordinary windfalls during marriages had a way of producing extraordinary disputes, and that the person who controlled the document controlled the outcome. Renee spent those 2 weeks the same way she spent every other week, at the front desk of the clinic, checking patients in, managing the schedule, making the afternoon coffee, driving home in the pewter Hyundai. She had moved into the apartment without argument, because Philip had advised visible cooperation and because she had no attachment to the house itself. Jerome had chosen the house. Jerome had furnished it to impress the people he brought over. She had lived in it and maintained it and kept it functioning, and she would find another one. She was not concerned about that. She called her Aunt Gloria in Memphis on a Sunday evening, 2 days after the meeting with Philip. Gloria was Calvin's sister, the woman who had sat beside him in the final weeks and who had known Renee since the day she came home from the hospital. Renee told her the outline of the situation in the careful shorthand of 2 people who had always understood each other without requiring full sentences. Gloria listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Your daddy drew up that paper because he told me once he had a feeling about Jerome. Not a bad feeling. An incomplete one. He said Jerome was a man who had never learned to ask the right questions about the people he claimed to love." Renee held that for a moment. "He asked me what I liked for breakfast," she said on our 3rd date, "and he remembered it for 6 months. "That's remembering an answer," Gloria said, "not asking a question." Renee thought about that for a full day, and then she set it down. Because her father had also told her that bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it, and she had more useful things to do with the investment. On the 14th day, Philip called to tell her the hearing was scheduled. Preparation was the only power that never ran out. The mediation hearing was held in a conference room at the courthouse on a Thursday morning in November, the kind of gray Tennessee morning where the light came in flat through the tall windows and made everything in the room look exactly as serious as it was. Renee arrived with Philip. She wore a dark blazer, and her hair pinned back the way she wore it to work. She carried nothing except her bag, and the copy of the clarity document Philip had already filed with the court, because the original was in the record, and she had no further need to produce it. Jerome arrived with Garrett and 2 associates. He had not looked at her since the night of the envelopes, and he did not look at her now. He was dressed in the manner of a man who had been advised to project confidence and had interpreted that instruction as wearing the most expensive suit available, which told its own story. There was a woman in the hallway outside the conference room when Renee arrived. Tall, polished, the kind of presentation that took considerable resources to maintain. Claudette. She did not enter the hearing room. She waited in the hall with the particular tension of someone who expected to be celebrating by noon. Garrett opened with a prepared statement about the nature of independent purchases within a marriage, the established legal precedent for separating personal expenditures from marital assets, and the timeline of the separation filing relative to the winnings announcement. He was practiced and precise. He had done this many times. He placed his summary documents at the center of the table with the ease of a man who believed he controlled the room. Philip let him finish. Then, Philip placed Calvin Bryant's clarity document at the center of the table. He did not explain it immediately. He allowed Garrett to read it. He allowed the two associates to read it. He allowed Jerome for the first time to read it fully. Because Jerome had never been shown it, not once in 16 years, and the expression that moved across his face as he reached the third paragraph was the expression of a man realizing that the floor he had been standing on was not solid. Philip explained then, in the calm and unhurried voice of a man with 26 years of practice and the full weight of Calvin Bryant's document behind him, what the clause meant, what the purchase date meant, what equitable distribution under Tennessee marital property law looked like when applied to an asset acquired with funds from a joint account during an intact marriage, regardless of whose hand held the ticket. Garrett attempted a response. He cited precedent. Philip cited counter-precedent that was more recent and more directly applicable, and he had cited it already in the pre-hearing brief, which Garrett had apparently not weighted as seriously as he should have. Jerome leaned toward Garrett and said something in a low voice. Garrett shook his head. Jerome tried one final maneuver, the one Renee had expected from the moment the envelopes landed on the counter. He looked at her directly for the first time that morning and said, with the warmth that had once been his best quality, "Renee, we don't need to do this. Whatever you need, I can make sure you're taken care of. You don't have to let it go this far." She looked at him the way her father had looked at contracts that contained unfavorable language, completely, without hurry, and without the slightest revision of her position. "Jerome," she said, in her ordinary voice, the one she used at the front desk and on the phone and at the dinner table for 16 years. "My father wrote that document because he understood something about you that you never understood about yourself. He understood that you saw me as a person who could be managed. And he spent an afternoon making sure that if that day ever came, the paper would say something different than you expected." She gathered her copy. "The paper is the truth," she said. "Everything else is conversation." She stood, and she walked out, and she did not look back, and the room behind her was very quiet. 9 months later, Renee Bryant sat on the back porch of a house in East Nashville that she had purchased outright, in cash, on a Wednesday morning in February with no ceremony at all. A 1940s Craftsman with original oak floors, and a back garden that had been allowed to grow past anyone's tending for long enough that the plants left behind had become interesting. There was a rose climbing the fence that no one had pruned in years and was now enormous and entirely in charge of its own situation, which she appreciated. She had spent the spring learning what was already living there and building around it rather than clearing it away. This was a philosophy her father would have recognized immediately. She was drinking coffee from a mug her niece had painted for her at a pottery class, and the morning was cool and specific, the way Nashville mornings are in early September when the summer is almost but not quite finished, and the light had a quality that felt like it was paying attention to things. Her settlement had been finalized in February, 3 weeks after the hearing. Tennessee equitable distribution applied to the full value of the winnings at the time they were announced during the marriage, had produced a figure that Philip described as appropriate, and that he delivered to her in a single phone call with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. She had directed the amount to 3 separate accounts the same afternoon, one for the house, one for her father's old building in Memphis, which she had purchased quietly from the estate 2 years before Jerome's lottery ticket ever existed, and which she now leased to a community legal aid clinic at below market rate, because her father would have liked that. and one that Calvin Bryant would have called the long account, the kind you fund and do not touch. The total settlement had come to $44 million after fees. She had not told anyone at the clinic. She was still at the front desk on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which was a decision she had made for reasons she did not explain to anyone except Philip, who had nodded as though he understood and probably did. There was someone who came on Saturday mornings. His name was Daniel, and he had done the work on her kitchen, a careful renovation she had planned herself down to the hardware. And at the end of the final walkthrough, he had asked, with the particular gravity of a man who expects a no and has already decided to be fine with that, whether she might like to have dinner. She had said yes because of the way he asked, without performance, without the calibrated warmth of a man selling something. He was quiet and curious and asked questions that required more than one sentence to answer, and he had not once in 6 months raised the subject of the settlement, which she found genuinely restful. Jerome's attorneys had filed 2 appeals. Garrett's name appeared on the first and not the second, which said something about how the first had gone. The second appeal was denied in May. Jerome had sold the house he purchased in February, the one he had shown to a local magazine before the ink was dry on his winnings transfer, at a significant loss in July. The circumstances were reported in 3 short paragraphs in the business section of the local paper, with a brevity reserved for stories that had become less interesting than they once promised to be. Claudette had relocated. Philip mentioned this in passing, and Renee registered it without comment and moved on. She turned the coffee mug in both hands and looked at the garden, where a row of dahlias she had put in during the first warm week of April were now tall enough to bow slightly in the morning wind, the heavy-headed flowers dipping and returning, with a particular patient rhythm of things that are exactly as strong as they need to be. She was solvent. She was free. She was unbothered. The paper had said exactly what her father told her it would say, on the day it needed to say it. She had not doubted that for a single morning in 16 years. She had simply kept the document in its place and waited for the conversation to catch up. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.